in the quiet heart of rural America, where dusty roads stretch between endless fields of corn and soybeans. A story was unfolding that no one could have predicted. Picture this: a teenage boy, barely 16, working under the blazing sun, his hands covered in grease and dirt, his eyes fixed on a pile of discarded metal parts that everyone else had written off as worthless junk, while most kids his age were spending their afternoons on video games or hanging out with friends. He was in a small makeshift workshop, piecing together what looked like fragments of broken dreams. But to him, these scraps weren't tea trash. They were the seeds of an idea that would soon shake one of the most powerful names in agriculture, John Deere. It started with whispers in the town. Neighbors passing by would slow their trucks just to get a glimpse of the strange contraption taking shape in his barn. Was it a science project, a hobby, or just a kid wasting his time? Nobody really knew. But what they didn't realize was that this determined teenager was about to pull off something extraordinary, with nothing more than cast-off engine parts, rusted wheels, and sheer grit. He was building a machine that would soon make headlines and force even industry giants to take notice. Now imagine being a farmer all your life, relying on tractors that cost as much as a house, and suddenly hearing about a teenager, a kid with no corporate backing, no engineering degree, who managed to build one from trash. The shock, the disbelief, and eventually the admiration would ripple far beyond his small town. And that's exactly where this story begins, with a dream too bold to ignore. A tractor unlike any other, and a teenager who proved that innovation doesn't always come from billion-dollar companies, but sometimes from a dusty little barn at the edge of nowhere. Long before the tractor began to take shape, this teenager's life was anything but easy. Born into a hard-working farming family, he grew up seeing the constant struggle of keeping old machinery alive on a budget that never seemed to stretch far enough. Every planting season was a gamble, and every harvest carried the weight of uncertainty. Tractors broke down, parts were expensive, and for small farmers like his family, buying brand new equipment from big companies was nothing more than a dream. Those early years carved something deep into him, a stubborn belief that if no one was going to make things easier for people like his family, then maybe he would. He had always been fascinated by machines. As a child, he would sneak into the barn and tinker with broken engines, not because anyone told him to, but because he couldn't help himself. He loved taking things apart just to see how they worked. Old lawnmowers, rusted car engines, broken bicycles. Anything discarded became his playground. Over time, what began as simple curiosity turned into skill. By the age of 15, he could repair almost anything with his bare hands, a wrench and whatever spare parts he managed to dig out of scrapyards. But there was a moment that pushed him over the edge, from simply fixing to creating. One hot summer afternoon, as his father struggled with a tractor that refused to start, frustration boiled over. The family's aging machine had become more of a burden than a help, constantly demanding repairs they couldn't afford. That night, sitting under a single flickering bulb in the barn, the boy stared at the rusted heap of parts around him and asked himself a question that would change everything. What if I could build one myself? That what if became an obsession. He sketched designs on old notebooks, stayed awake past midnight studying diagrams of engines he had found at the library, and taught himself principles of mechanics through trial and error. Slowly, an impossible dream began to feel just a little bit possible. But what he didn't know was that his journey would not only transform his family, ES Farm, it would eventually catch the attention of John Deere itself. The project began in secret. He didn't announce it, didn't brag about it, and certainly didn't tell his father what he was planning. After all, who would believe that a teenager could build a working tractor from nothing but junkyard scraps? Instead, he quietly collected parts that most people considered useless. A broken transmission from an old pickup truck, an abandoned diesel engine that hadn't run in years, tires so worn they looked like they'd never roll again. Each piece, though flawed, held potential in his eyes. His barn soon transformed into a battlefield of tools and metal. The sound of hammers echoed into the night. Sparks flew from welding attempts, and the floor was littered with bolts and gears. The process was slow, often frustrating. Engines refused to start, axles didn't align, and more than once, he considered walking away. But each failure only fueled him more. Where others saw a dead end, he saw another problem to solve, and that relentless determination became his greatest weapon. As weeks turned into months, something incredible began to emerge from the chaos. The skeleton of a machine stood tall in the middle of the barn. It wasn't pretty. In fact, to anyone else, it looked like a Frankenstein of machinery. Mismatched parts bolted together with no regard for aesthetics. But he wasn't building it for looks. He was building it to work. And when he finally managed to attach the engine, wire up a crude ignition system, and fit the wheels into place, the sight of it standing there filled him with a pride he had never felt before. Neighbors started noticing. On weekends, when he dragged parts across the yard or rolled out the strange half-tractor for testing, curious eyes peeked over fences. Word spread quickly. The kid's building something in his barn. Some laughed at the idea. Others doubted he'd ever make it run. But deep down, a sense of anticipation was building in the community. Because if, by some miracle, this boy actually pulled it off, it would be unlike anything they had ever seen. And then, the moment everyone doubted finally came. The day he decided it was time to try starting the engine. The first start attempt was nothing short of dramatic. He had spent nearly 2 weeks fine-tuning the engine, checking every hose, tightening every bolt, and praying that the rusty old diesel block he salvaged would actually fire. Early one morning, with the barn doors wide open and the cool mist of dawn rolling over the fields, he climbed into the crude metal seat he had welded together. His hands trembled slightly as he gripped the ignition switch. For a moment, the entire barn was silent except for the distant sound of birds. Then he turned the key. At first, the machine coughed and sputtered like a tired old man trying to catch his breath. Black smoke puffed out of the exhaust, and the whole frame rattled violently. Neighbors who had gathered at a distance shook their heads, convinced it was about to fall apart. But then, against all odds, the engine roared to life. A deep, guttural growl filled the barn, and the ground itself seemed to tremble. The boy's face lit up with a mix of relief and triumph. After months of sleepless nights, after endless trial and error, his junkyard tractor was alive. He pressed gently on the improvised throttle, and the machine lurched forward. It wasn't smooth, and it certainly wasn't fast, but it moved. Every turn of the wheels felt like a victory march. Neighbors who had come expecting a failure now stood in stunned silence, their skepticism replaced with wide-eyed disbelief. A teenager had done what seasoned mechanics in town would have dismissed as impossible. Some clapped, some laughed in astonishment, and one older farmer muttered under his breath, "That kid just built a tractor out of trash." But for the boy, this was just the beginning. Starting the engine was one thing, proving that his creation could actually work in the fields was another. And if it failed there, all of his effort would be reduced to nothing more than a noisy experiment. With determination burning brighter than ever, he prepared for the ultimate test. Taking his homemade tractor into the fields his family had struggled to cultivate for years. The test in the fields was the moment that would either make or break his dream. That afternoon, with the sun hanging low over the horizon, he drove the tractor out of the barn and into the soil his family had worked on for generations. His father stood a few feet away, arms crossed, skeptical, but quietly hopeful. Neighbors lined the edge of the fence, whispering. Waiting to see whether this strange contraption would crumble under the weight of real work, he lowered the plow he had welded to the back and tightened his grip on the wheel. The engine growled, belching smoke as he pressed the throttle. The machine jerked, hesitated, then pushed forward, cutting its first line through the dry earth. At first, the plow bounced unevenly, the frame shaking violently, but then it steadied. The soil began to turn, row after row, as the homemade tractor dug into the field with surprising strength. Gasps rippled through the crowd. It wasn't just moving, it was working. His father's expression softened. This was more than just a project now. It was something practical, something useful, something that could change the way they farmed. For the first time in years, the family wasn't relying on a broken-down, overpriced machine that drained their pockets. They were watching a teenager's vision come to life. A tractor built, not by engineers in a corporate lab, but by a boy who refused to accept limits. As the rows of freshly turned soil grew longer, neighbors began to cheer. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others shouted words of encouragement. "Look at that thing go!" One farmer laughed. Another muttered, half in admiration, half in jealousy. That kid just did what companies charge thousands for. It wasn't sleek, it wasn't green and shiny like a John Deere, but it was effective. and that was what mattered most. What none of them knew, however, was that this incredible experiment was about to travel far beyond their small town. Because soon, word of the boy's invention would spread, catching the attention of people he never imagined would notice, including the world's biggest name in tractors. It didn't take long for the story to spread beyond the fences of his family's farm. At first, it was just neighbors talking, local farmers stopping by, and a few photos passed around town. But soon, one spark turned into a fire. A small newspaper ran an article about the teen farmer who built a tractor from junk. That story caught the attention of a regional TV station, and within days, a camera crew arrived at the farm. The boy, nervous but honest, explained how he had built the machine. He spoke about the scrapyard parts, the long nights in the barn, and his determination to prove that farming did not always depend on expensive, factory-made equipment. Footage of his homemade tractor moving through the fields played on evening news programs across the state. What began as a small project was now a story people everywhere were talking about. Social media made the story even bigger. Videos of the tractor spread quickly. Many viewers praised him as a young genius. Others debated whether a homemade tractor could ever compete with major brands. Comment sections filled with arguments, admiration, and doubt. But one thing was clear: people were paying attention. Then the unexpected happened. Among all the reactions came a phone call that changed everything. It was not from a neighbor or a journalist, but from John Deere itself. At first, the family thought it was a joke. Why would one of the biggest agricultural companies in the world care about a teenager's scrapyard tractor? But the call was real. John Deere wanted to see the invention with their own eyes. For the boy, this was both exciting and terrifying. Showing his tractor to neighbors was one thing, but showing it to John Deere was another challenge entirely. The day John Deere came to town felt unreal. A sleek black SUV rolled up the dirt road leading to his family's farmhouse, and out stepped a group of men in crisp suits, their polished shoes already coated in dust. For a company known for its massive factories, billion-dollar operations, and glossy marketing campaigns, this visit to a teenager's barn in the middle of nowhere was unusual. Yet here they were, eager to see what all the noise was about. The boy stood nervously by his tractor, wiping his hands on his oil-stained jeans. He wasn't polished, he wasn't rehearsed, but he was ready. One of the representatives walked around the machine, studying it carefully, touching the frame, examining the crude welds, and running his hand along the patched-together body. To outsiders, it still looked like a Frankenstein creation. But to these men, there was something undeniably impressive. It worked, and not just worked, it worked with a kind of rugged efficiency that spoke to the heart of farming itself. They asked him questions, technical ones. What engine did he use? How did he manage the transmission? How did he overcome the lack of proper hydraulics? To their surprise, he answered every single one, explaining the details with the confidence of someone who had lived inside this machine for months. It wasn't textbook knowledge, it was raw experience, and that, more than anything, seemed to impress them. Wordlessly, one of the men gestured for him to start it up. The boy climbed into the seat, turned the key, and once again, the engine roared to life. The tractor groaned and rumbled across the dirt, pulling a plow behind it with ease. The John Deere men exchanged quick glances. They hadn't expected much, maybe just a noisy stunt, but what they saw was a machine born from necessity, creativity, and pure determination. By the time the test run ended, one thing was clear. This wasn't just a quirky project from a kid with too much time on his hands. It was a statement, a reminder that innovation doesn't always come from boardrooms and laboratories, but sometimes from a teenager with a dream and a pile of scrap metal, and for John Deere, it posed a question they couldn't ignore. If one boy could do this, what did it say about the future of farming technology? The meeting with John Deere left the boy and his family in awe, but also with a lingering tension. What would happen next? Were they impressed enough to help him? Or were they worried about the message his invention sent, that farmers might not always need to rely on expensive machines? For days, rumors swirled in town. Some neighbors whispered that John Deere would buy his design, others said they'd shut him down. The boy, however, didn't let the speculation distract him. He kept improving the tractor, adding reinforcements, tweaking the engine, and making it more reliable with every run. Then came the letter, sealed in the company's bold green and yellow. It invited him and his family to visit John Deere's headquarters. At first, his father hesitated. They were simple farmers, after all, not business people. But this wasn't an opportunity you could ignore. Within weeks, the boy found himself standing inside one of the most advanced tractor plants in the world, surrounded by machines that dwarfed anything he had ever seen. Gleaming production lines stretched out before him, spotless and massive, a world apart from his dusty little barn back home. Executives and engineers gathered around him, some smiling with curiosity, others more cautious. They showed him the cutting-edge technology that powered their billion-dollar machines. But they also listened as he described his own creation. What shocked him most was that these professionals didn't laugh. They didn't dismiss his tractor as a toy. Instead, they acknowledged what he had done. He had built something functional, with no resources, no team, and no formal training. That, they admitted, was extraordinary. The boy realized something profound that day. While John Deere had the money, the factories, and the engineers, what he had was different, something that couldn't be taught in schools or replicated by corporations. He had ingenuity born from necessity, the kind of problem-solving that comes from real struggle, where failure isn't an option because survival depends on success. And as he looked at the polished tractors lined up in the showroom, he couldn't help but wonder, was the future of farming innovation really in places like this? Or could it just as easily begin in barns like his? Back in his hometown, the boy's life would never be the same. The story of his tractor had gone from a local headline to a national conversation. Farming magazines ran detailed features about him, YouTubers made videos analyzing his invention, and social media platforms buzzed with debates. Some people hailed him as the embodiment of American grit, a reminder that determination and creativity could overcome even the steepest challenges. Others questioned what this meant for the farming industry. If a teenager could build a tractor from scraps, what did it say about the skyrocketing prices farmers were forced to pay for brand new equipment? Farmers from across the country began reaching out. Letters arrived, emails poured in, and even handwritten notes showed up at his family's mailbox. People wanted to know how he did it, what parts he used, and whether he could help them build one too. It was overwhelming, but it also made him realize something powerful. His project wasn't just about one tractor anymore. It had touched a nerve in the farming world. It had become a symbol of independence, of farmers taking back control from corporations that often left them feeling powerless. Meanwhile, John Deere remained silent in public. The company didn't issue statements, didn't make any bold announcements, but their quiet interest was obvious. Insiders whispered that they were studying his design, not because they wanted to copy it, but because they needed to understand how someone with no resources had managed to create something so effective. Some saw it as a threat. Others saw it as inspiration. But either way, the message was clear. A teenager had forced one of the world's largest agricultural giants to pay attention. As for the boy, he still spent his evenings in the barn, not chasing fame or fortune, but doing what he had always done: tinkering, experimenting, and trying to make his machine better. Fame hadn't changed him. What mattered most was that his family's farm could finally keep going without depending on a tractor they couldn't afford. And for him, that victory meant more than any headline or corporate recognition ever could. In the end, what began as a desperate attempt to solve his family's struggles grew into something far bigger, a story that challenged the way people thought about farming, innovation, and even the balance of power between everyday farmers and the corporations that supply them. The boy hadn't just built a tractor, he had built a statement, a reminder that true innovation often rises from necessity, and that sometimes the boldest ideas don't come from billion-dollar research labs, but from a kid with nothing more than determination, scrap metal, and a dream. For John Deere, his invention was both humbling and inspiring. It proved that ingenuity can thrive outside the boundaries of tradition, and that the future of farming might not only belong to giant machines and complex technology, but also to those who dare to think differently. And for the farming community, his story became a spark of hope. Proof that even in the face of rising costs, debt, and pressure, solutions can still be found in the most unlikely of places. Years from now, people in his town will still remember the sight of that rattling, smoke-belching tractor cutting its first row through the soil. They'll remember the disbelief on their faces, the cheers that followed, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing one of their own achieve the impossible. And maybe, just maybe, his story will inspire other young dreamers to pick up a wrench, chase an idea, and believe that even the most impossible challenge can be overcome. Because in the end, this wasn't just the story of a machine. It was the story of a teenager who dared to prove that greatness doesn't come from what you have. It comes from what you do with what little you've got.